firstly, very briefly about myself. I see myself as an activist scholar. I have one leg in activism and one leg inside of the universities. So I have been, as Benjamin said, involved in the Plowshares movement, where we did civil disobedience of direct actions, destroying, or as we would say, disarm equipments for nuclear weapons. Because governments are not disarming, then we decided to do it. So I spent more than a year in prison because of that. I was also involved in the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza, and I have been deported from Israel because of that. I visited the Kurdish areas and their struggle. I visited the Western Sahara occupied territories, interviewed people. I have been at conferences talking together with Sahrawi activists in the refugee camps in Algeria. I've been working very much in India. I've been working in Brazil, and currently I have an amazing position that is made possible by a donation from Quakers at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. It's actually the first position of a professor endowed with the possibility of doing work on bridging between activists and academics. It's called the endowed chair of the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance at Massachusetts in the United States. Like most of you, I'm in a lockdown situation now. I am in my activist community in Sweden, in the forest. So that's me. I want to talk to you today about the possibilities and what I see as the problems in collaborations between activists and academics that are interested in liberation struggles. And that speaks to indirectly and directly to the struggle in Western Sahara and in Palestine, Kurdistan, Kashmir, Tibet, West Papua, and similar places among indigenous people or in other places like that. So I want to make you aware that there exists something called resistance studies nowadays, which is an emerging field of relevance for liberation that since at least the 1980s is growing within the universities. At the same time, some movements are creating activist schools or universities, which then is a way to develop knowledge and training independently, while often in collaboration with some experts and academics from outside of the movements. And another way this is happening, this kind of collaboration, is the increasing networking among activists through workshops and forums in which movements learn from each other, where an older generation of activists share their experiences with the younger one and across different sites of struggles in the world where academics often play a supportive role. That existed most prominently in the World Social Forum from 2001 up until recently. But it's now taking other forms, more decentralized and topic-specific forms that I want to tell you about. But let me begin by saying what is the problems here that activists and academics are trying to deal with when they collaborate around the liberation. Although we might be individuals that are interested in human liberation, we face very big challenges. One part of the problem is that knowledge for human liberation in the modern society has been, in a way, monopolized by the universities and academics, designed to serve the nation state and elite dominance, discipline of populations towards increased capitalist production and imperialist projects. So academia has been or university has been hijacked in the modern society to serve power and dominance. So that's a reality which we need to deal with, which is part of the problem. Another part of the problem, I would say, is that liberation movements, although being the main historic force, I would argue, in creating radical social change over history, They are often ineffective and get crushed or marginalized by state repression and terror against them, of heavy and violent kind. And when they are impactful, they often end up creating new relations of dominance, creating new exclusions and authoritarian structures and repression of new groups. We have seen that in many of the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So this is a real problem for us that are interested in human liberation. And while there are both radical and liberation-oriented academics within the cracks of this imperialist academia, and some intellectual activists within movements that try to learn from past mistakes and develop new creative strategies and ways of organizing, we all know that we seem to lose towards authoritarian, fascist, fundamentalist, and neoliberal forces. And the world is facing a lot of major and increasing challenges of inequalities, ecological crisis, and systemic violence against marginalized groups. We all know this, so I won't go into that. Instead, I want to talk about where I see at least some reason to hope, some way forward. And my humble suggestion, which is just one part of what we need to do, I understand it's a limited one, but I think it's an important one, is that we need to find forms of more effective resistance and higher quality collaborations by building the kind of knowledge we need to promote human liberation that makes a real difference, at least in the long run. So we need to base our struggles on relevant knowledge. And I would argue that that knowledge is not really possible to develop only by academics or only by activists. We need to collaborate around that. Okay, so a key important part here is that within academia, some activist scholars have already tried to develop something along this line, but it's happening too much in isolation. Anyway, it's a matter of academic professionals interested to not just study and understand resistance against domination in different parts of the world, but by different groups and throughout history, but also generate useful knowledge together with and for the benefits of activists. That's kind of the orientation. I mean, of course, perhaps always this has always existed. We know that Marxists were trying to do the same 150 years ago through the first and the other internationals. But there has been increased activities in waves since the 1960s and again from the 1980s and in the last 20 years of people trying to do this. But as I said, it happens, unfortunately, broadly speaking, in isolation from movement debates, even if it's done by supportive researchers or former activists that enter the universities and then lose kind of the contact to their movement background. I'm talking here about academic studies by activist-oriented academics of social movements, revolution, Marxism theory, gender, critical race theory, African American studies, queer studies, post-colonialism, and all that. But the last 20 years, I think something more promising have happened, where there is something of a development which then is called resistance studies, more explicitly, not just with some orientation that is relevant to resistance, but it's actually in itself naming itself as resistance studies. And it comes from the inspiration from the history from below that is kind of a Marxist trend, and peasant studies and subaltern studies in India and in England. And in like 15 years ago, some people at the Gothenburg University in Sweden started to develop resistance networks, like the Global Resistance Network that has a website and some 300 individuals associated to it. And unfortunately only so far universities in Sweden, the UK, and the United States, where there's a urgent need of bringing in universities in the global south, but it's at least a beginning. And then we have the Resistance Studies Initiative at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, there where I'm working. It's a small place, but we are doing something that I will tell you more about very soon. With this, we have all these normal academic production of journals, book series, and all that, and academic conferences. But we also have university courses that are not just for undergraduates and graduates, but there's also open ones to the public, which, if people are interested, is something that you can join in online and so. We also have a collaboration with Waging Nonviolence, which is a news site for very activist-oriented popular summaries of some of the research results. Okay, so I don't want to go into deep into this, but I want to make clear for you that there exist already then allies to you as activists. There exist allies within the universities that are working on and trying to be relevant to liberation struggles. All right. But then there's another trend which I find incredibly promising and interesting, and that's the activist schools within movements. Or as they say in South Africa, which I think is a beautiful expression, the professors of the street. Because it's a recognition of that activists are always doing research. It's just not called that because of this monopolizing of the universities of the mainstream. But the professors of the street are an expression of the research that activists are always doing. You know, when activists are experimenting with different tactics and strategies, learn from mistakes, evaluate, and try new things, there is a buildup of knowledge. And that's kind of expressed in this South African expression, professors of the street. So we're not talking about normal universities, but autonomous, run by movements. So training and dissemination of knowledge is happening to new generations, and the development of new professionals at these activist schools, initiated, owned, and run by movement organizations through people from the movements, that utilize assistance from people outside of the movements. And what I'm thinking, and which is one of the ideas I think I would like to get input on, that what would happen if we connected globally these activist schools with each other? And I'm not aware of, and maybe there are, activist schools in the occupied territories of, for example, Kurdistan or Kashmir or Tibet or Western Sahara, Palestine, that could be linked into this. But just to give you some examples of those activist schools I've come across. So there's a democracy school in Rajasthan in India that is trying to teach activists how to do activism in for example, the fight for freedom for information and the right to information against the state, which is the movement that took the initiative, have been behind that campaign that has been largely successful in India. And then the biggest social movement in South America, the landless workers movement, the MST, they have actually a full-blown activist university outside of Sao Paulo. It's a free university for everyone. There's no tuition. It's not just for the landless workers within the MST, but it's for all movements in South America to join in. You have to pay your own travel there, but it's free to be at the school. You do some work hours every day to contribute to the school, and then there are courses. And I want to emphasize, so it's not a training in how to do ecological agriculture and so on, which would be maybe what you think when it's something organized by the landless workers in a kind of peasant movement. But it is an activist university. It's about how to do activism in an effective way, because they have other schools that are dealing with the ecological agriculture and so on. There's a similar project in Uganda, organized by the Solidarity Uganda movement. And they are building up library, they're building up collaboration with universities, and they are doing trainings of their activists. And then in South Africa, outside Durban, you have the Abalali University of the Poor, where the so-called shack dwellers, the shack intellectuals, are doing living learning, as they call it. And I also visited in November the Maori Cultural Center in Pariaka in Aotearoa in New Zealand that is doing similar kind of training and are planning to develop this kind of work. I can give you links to these kind of places if you're interested, but this is just, you know, some examples of what I'm talking about. So I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about is activists creating their own schools, their autonomous schools for developing the knowledge and really themselves figure out how to connect theory and practice. So that I would say is the counterpart to the few academics inside of the mainstream imperialist universities that are trying to do liberation-oriented research. That would be these activist schools, but they're not really connected. These activist schools are not really connected even with each other. All right, so now I come to the third thing that I think is interesting when it comes to thinking around how to build spaces together and collaborate and building this knowledge for liberation, and that's the forums. The forums or the gatherings and workshops as spaces of learning for each other, which is not really a matter of having a training in the school sense, or it's not a matter of having a panel with experts that tell you what you should think, but we're talking about forums in the way that they are participative discussions from the grassroots with self-organized workshops. So it's a matter of a space of dialogue across differences of generations, organizations, identities, within a strand of liberation struggles organized and led by affected people themselves, with the assistance from solidarity activists and activist scholars. So the most important example of this is the World Social Forum that from 2001, actually where the MST, the landless workers, were instrumental as one of the initiators of this. So the first World Social Forum happened in Porto Alegre in South Brazil, actually also the birthplace of the landless workers. And these happened about yearly, and sometimes in different places where there were the African Social Forum, the Asian Social Forum, the European Social Forum, and so on. And they were really massive at occasions with 50,000, sometimes 100,000 participants in small organized workshops initiated by the people that participated themselves. So it created a kind of open space politics, an openness for all participants to organize seminars, panels, or trainings at that place, but where the dialogue was in the center, where they were possible to have different topics, create alliances and campaigns within that forum. And I would argue in a summary way that the World Social Forum was a major success for the first decade. But after that, it's been a decreasing activity and enthusiasm. And today, most probably, it's not able anymore to maintain its role. And it's more the international NGOs and the professional, established and reform activist groups that have taken over. And fewer people are participating. So, because of that background, and inspired by the example of the World Social Forum, the Resistance Studies Initiative that I'm heading then at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, we have tried something else. Obviously, we don't have the capacity to make something that is so large as the World Social Forum. So what we did was to provide a space and funding for smaller gatherings of 40 to 50 participants from during 2-3 full days, with a smaller number of solidarity activists and activist scholars that mainly listen to activist discussions and learn. We had no media participation, but the discussions were happening in privacy with an aim to find common grounds and collaborations. So in 2016, we organized a Black Liberation Gathering from whole North America, where people from the 1960s of the Black Power period and the Civil Rights Movement came to this gathering, meeting with the young leaders of the movement for Black Lives today, to have an intergenerational dialogue, and also across different organizations, those that were more Malcolm X oriented or even Black Liberation Army oriented, or those that were more Christian faith based, discussed with each other about experiences and learnings. And then in 2019, last year, we organized the same for Native Americans. Together with Native Americans, we organized then meetings of those that came from the Red Power period in the 60s and those that were active at Standing Rock mobilization and other struggles. So in a similar way, we were and are planning a gathering of occupied people from 8 different occupied territories, from West Papua, from Tibet, Kashmir, Kurdistan, Palestine, Western Sahara, Ambazonia, and Puerto Rico to together gather in Nepal on somewhat neutral ground, and for 5 days discuss experiences so that Western Sahrawis can learn from the experience of the West Papuans, and the people in Kurdistan can learn from the experiences in Tibet, and by that building up knowledge together. And then the role of the academics would mainly be to sit and listen, to learn and develop research projects from hearing what are the concerns and the key questions that these activists are struggling with. So the question is then, though, and that's where I kind of want to end this now, is how do we do this in an effective way with high quality? How to spread it so that more people do similar things? And then because of that, I want to highlight to you some of the challenges, the many challenges I see in doing this. So one of the problems in working around liberation knowledge and working between activists on the ground and academics at universities is that we have very different ways of talking about the same problems. And there's a lack of tight interaction and collaboration in projects. Often the research questions have very little to do with the problems that activists actually grapple with. And the funding very often for research at university comes from mainstream institutions that are not interested in the problems of Palestinians or Sahrawis or Tibetans. And we publish in journals and books that very few people have the capacity or time to read. So that is one problem, that's one challenge to overcome somehow. Another problem is that we have very different positions in the world system. Academics and activists come from very different realities. There's very huge differences in resources and the legitimacy of knowledge and the hierarchies that we live with of different kind. So very often the activist knowledge is looked down upon and it's not seen as being real research. Although it's based on experiences, learning from the pragmatic experimentation and evaluations of refining strategies and tactics, which in my view is definitely research. So these differences in positions is another challenge that's really important. Another challenge that I want to mention is that I think it's a matter of avoiding the 2 traps of the extremes here in collaboration. On the one hand, we would have the collaboration that activists are seen as the ones that are knowing best, and then they subordinate activist academics to just do research service and provide knowledge for the activists. That's one extreme. Another extreme is that academics are seen as the ones that know better and they give advice to the activists of how to do it. I think we need to look for something that is of more of an equal collaboration, where we can appreciate that academics have more resources and a training of systematic knowledge work that could provide critical reflections for activists that don't really have the time and the resources to spend that much energy in looking at examples in history and other places. And where academics need to understand that activists are also doing research. So if we have more of an equal collaboration, I think that could be amazing, but that's a challenge. So basically, I want to end with what I think is the main challenges, and that is how to find good forms of collaborations. I'm dreaming of a collaboration that would mean that activists are setting the priorities, that activists are asking the research questions, and that activists own the results, but academics are relatively autonomous in doing critical systematic investigations, and that there is a dialogue between activists and academics in finding out this knowledge. And here I think we can learn from the indigenous peoples research methodology and participatory action research that already exist thanks to radical academics that comes from movements that have entered into the universities. Right. I hope now that I have provoked you to come with your own examples of what works and what doesn't work. I hope I have inspired you to see that there is this possibility of collaboration. And please come with both comments and questions. This is not a situation where I have really any kind of answers, but I have more questions that I could give you. So I think it's a matter of us together trying to figure out better ways forward, because I mean, let's face it, friends, we are now in the moment where the exploitative world capitalist system is brought to a standstill because we are only buying what we need. And there's an economic crisis because of that. And that is an opportunity. In the true meaning of crisis, it's an opportunity for us to transform and go somewhere else. But in order to do that, we need to actually build on knowledge when we're trying to transform societies and create something of a true human liberation. And I don't think we can do that by one group monopolizing the knowledge, be that academics or activists, be that people in the occupied territories of Palestine, or be that the activists in Tibet or anywhere else. We need to collaborate, and we need to find forms that are not exploitative. We need to find forms that are not creating colonial relations again. Thank you.